Welcome, everyone, to the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design. I am Gretchen Marie Schaefer. I'm the director of REMCAD's Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program, or what we call the VASD program. The VASD program is an interdisciplinary initiative that values passionate curiosity and explores critical, diverse, and creative inquiry through all types of events and presentations. We are always so honored to further enrich the academic experience for all of our students here at the college, and also to offer these events and presentations to the broader Denver metro community. So thanks everyone for coming out again tonight. So tonight, I am very excited to introduce the fourth presentation in the VASD program's year-long pattern series, which explores the multifaceted and dynamic nature of repetition in contemporary art and culture. From DNA to data, from ornamentation to textiles, from history to habits, the universe is full of order derived from chaos. And as life becomes increasingly complicated, the power of predictable groupings and regimented simple narratives grows increasingly alluring. Through April, the series will continue to reflect on the human desire for symmetry, categorization, and repetitive alignment at a time when social and political progress simultaneously aims for a more nuanced and intersectional perspective. And I am just so absolutely honored to have renowned artist Paul Pfeiffer here tonight as part of this series. Paul was born in Honolulu and grew up in the Philippines, and now splits his time between his New York and Manila studios. He earned his BFA in printmaking from the San Francisco Art Institute and his MFA from Hunter College, and was a participant in the Whitney Independent Study Program. He was featured in the PBS series Art 21 and is the recipient of a number of awards, most notably the Albert Award for Visual Arts from CalArts, a United States Artist Fellowship, and the inaugural Bucksbaum Award from the Whitney Museum. Paul's work has been seen in numerous national and international exhibitions, including the Whitney Biennial, PS1's Greater New York, the Sydney Biennial, the 2001 Venice Biennale, and most recently, the Performa Biennial in New York. In his talk tonight, Paul will present a selection of his video, sculptural, and photographic projects from the late 90s to today. Always pushing the frontiers and possibilities of any one medium, Paul samples, reflects, and loops images and objects from diverse corners of popular culture, reveling in the hypnotic power of repetition. He explores the psychological and political impact of seductive and manipulative displays of visual opulence in cultural arenas like megachurches, professional sports, game shows, beauty pageants, celebrity, and most recently, the University of Georgia's Redcoat Marching Band playing live and via live stream at the historic Apollo Theater in New York. But as an artist critical of mass-produced and mass-circulated images, I'd caution you not to assume that his interest in these displays of amazing spectacle reveal a personal reverence for any one of these cultural phenomena. For this evening's pattern series talk, titled Revelation 21, Paul will focus in particular on the pattern of religious iconography and references that run throughout his diverse and extensive body of work. At a time when repercussions from pervasive manipulation and saturation of images verges on the apocalyptic, Paul points to saints, places of worship, spiritual transformation, and biblical language and imagery to identify and translate the unspoken and often unconscious subtextual underpinnings of current modes of populist discourse in public spheres. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Paul Pfeiffer.
Thank you for that super cool welcome. You just said like almost everything I wanted to say, so I don't have to say it anymore. I did, when Gretchen asked me to give a kind of like a description of the talk, I decided to focus it on the presence of religion in contemporary art. And it's just something I've been thinking about, well, for a long time, but especially now, because, well, it seems written large these days. And especially the kind of like merging of religious culture and mass religious culture and entertainment culture that's happening seems very particular to now. In fact, the real thing that I'm interested in focusing on is not religion per se, but really thinking about mass religion as one way to think about it is in terms of communication strategy. Like really there's a kind of like great innovation that's happening around like how to reach the maximum number of people, and really like there seems to be like a kind of like an explosive growth in this type of innovation. And it's not solely around mega churches and mass religion, but to me, that's one place where it appears very clearly, and that's why I'm interested. But really, it goes back, like I've been using religious titles for a long time. Like I come from a family of church musicians, actually, and well, yeah, I have stuff to say about it, but I'm gonna go ahead and like show you this first thing. So this this video came from an invitation from Frieze, London, the art fair, to make a 3-minute video that they would play on BBC 4. And it so happened at the time I was like, there was this particular moment, I think in January 2018, I think, either that or 2019. I think it's 2018, where Justin Bieber came out as Born Again. And like the reason I knew about it is that I was actually kind of loosely working on a project in the Philippines about the biggest megachurch in the Philippines, a church called the Iglesia ni Cristo. And it so happened that while I was over there, Justin Bieber was scheduled to give a concert in this enormous arena, which is like the sort of the flagship 21st century temple of the Iglesia ni Cristo, but which they also rent out for like basketball games and for like rock concerts and stuff like that. U2 just performed there. Anyway, just before he was meant to give this concert in Manila, he canceled the last third of his world tour. And it was at that moment that he sort of like had some kind of major change and then reappeared sort of buddies with this guy, Carl Lentz, who leads the megachurch called Hillsong Church, which originally started in Australia, but now has like major presence in both New York and LA, and is known for having quite a few like sort of entertainment industry and sports stars going to that church. And like in the first week of January in 2018, Justin Bieber posted a picture on Instagram showing him on his private plane, and he like was shirtless, and he's like starting to be covered with like religious tattoos, and he had a Bible sitting in his lap, and if you look closely, you could see that the Bible was like covered with like underlines, like Justin had been like studying it really intently. So like, I don't know, like the tour that he was having at that time, I think it was called the Purpose Tour. And that song was one of the songs from the Purpose Tour, a song called I'll Show You. I don't mean to go on, but I just felt like there was this like dense layering of things going on. And I don't know what they mean, but something about the sort of like the intense presence and following of Justin Bieber, almost like Christ-like, and his like famously young followers, his like global reach, and then the fact that he came out as sort of like one of the first like real pop stars / evangelists, where he started really, giving sermons, was all very like layered to me. And maybe the one thing that I'll say, and then I'm really going to stop, is that one of the ways that I think about religion around the particular ways, strategies of communication that are involved. One thing is that it's actually megachurches who are often in different parts of the world the first to adopt new technologies, such as HD and other video technologies, since in a sense like megachurches are like broadcast operations. And yet, the nature of the messaging is ultimately open-ended. Like, things can be read in multiple ways. It reminds me of editing, the way that a service is put together or the way the message is put together in a religious setting. it seems designed to reach its membership. And so there appears to be like a lot of thought put into what people are looking for, and then addressing that need. This to me is something like what an editor does. An editor, in a way, doesn't do anything unless it's meant to elicit a certain reaction in the viewer's eye or in the viewer's mind. And a lot of it passes almost like subliminally, and yet everything is very meticulously set up to be received in a certain way. So that, like the idea of religion and communication strategies, to me, really, what's of interest is that series of thoughts, or like the skills and the toolkit of the editing studio, the post-production studio, both as like a literal technological thing, but also as like a way of thinking. Almost like an ontological approach to shaping relationships, or shaping how someone will receive something. This is my first video. Actually, from I think 1998 or 99. And the title is The Pure Products Go Crazy, which is the title of a poem by William Carlos Williams. And it was made, using like an early computer, using Premiere. And the main thing I want to say about it is that, I loved working in video on the computer the first time I, was exposed to it. It reminded me of printmaking, and talking about patterns. To me, the most essential structure of digital video to me is a loop. And it's one of those things where, I don't know, if you weren't kind of walking on two legs in the late 90s, it's hard to imagine that that a world existed before memes, and but in some ways the technology predicted it, because the first thing you do when you play with video on a computer is just scrub it back and forth. And yeah, so it just intuitively made perfect sense to take, this is a scene that for some reason is burned in my head from the movie Risky Business. And it's that famous scene where he's dancing in his underwear, but just taking a little part of it and looping it. So then this is the second video that I made around the same time. And this one, I don't know how I got to it, but I guess it was because I was doing a lot of stuff in Photoshop, and then I immediately thought, oh, there's got to be a way to do cloning, stamping on video. And at the time, the way to do that was you could not import, but download a moving image as a series of still frames in Premiere. And so I brought each frame into Photoshop and photoshopped it and then put it back together, basically to remove a lot of other elements in there. The title of this is fragment of a crucifixion. That's just to show you. This was like the first like portable video projector. It was made by Sony. It was called the party projector or something like that. And yeah, like I mean, it was literally the only thing available. So what was cool about it is that it allowed you to project an image like 4 by 5 inches, really small. And to me, that in some ways like made the whole thing a sculpture instead of a video. These are photographs. This is like part of a triptych of videos of Muhammad Ali's 3 most famous fights. And at this point, like I found a thing called Commotion, which is, like rotoscoping software. So it like helped do erasure on video a little bit faster, but still like super, super slow. Yeah, think about the choice of these images from the context of basketball and boxing is they're just like really foreign to me. Like I didn't grow up as a sports fan, and at the same time, specifically those sports like soccer, basketball, boxing. These are like the sports where you see the human body like almost naked. And so in terms of like thinking about the history of image making, painting, and so forth, it just seemed like this amazing source of like found images of human bodies in like sort of extreme circumstances. And they already have a kind of like built-in psychology. Like in some ways I feel like these images are like they're like a matrix in the sense that they, if tweaked, could like be made to mean many different things in the one image. And to me, like that's similar to the what I find interesting about, say, like religious titles, is that they're so ingrained, maybe, and so ancient that we carry around an infrastructure to interpret them in a certain way, and so like to invoke them invokes like the entire layered history and infrastructure in a relatively simple way, which to me is sort of like what I think of as art as trying to do, is to create things that are like a matrix. The title of this piece is Desiderata. You know that poem? My dad carried it around in his wallet his whole life, and it's just a really beautiful poem. Very Protestant, I think. I wish I could read it, the Desiderata. Like, it has this, it's sort of like walk through the world and like don't be disturbed by like people making loud noises. Just like do your thing, you know, like very kind of Puritan, like self-reliance and kind of like live simply and do your best kind of like message. Which to me is like perverse thinking about, I don't know, like the amount of effort put into like creating distractions now. And that's the little DVD player that it plays on. Oops. This piece is called Live Evil, which is the title of a Miles Davis album. And I forget what you call it when a word is spelled the same way, forward and backward. Palindrome. I like the palindrome quality of it. And it's like a very specific, like I've actually done like a bunch of different videos in a series. And they're all the same moment from like a particular concert of Michael Jackson. It's him singing Stranger in Moscow, and it's a moment like in the middle of the song where he like stops singing and then does the robot dance. Or like the robot dance. Which to me, like, I feel like everybody who sees that, like, and then the crowd cheers. Like, why does the crowd cheer? It's because, like, I think, like, we identify somehow with what he's doing. Like, human mimicking a machine. Like, we recognize it, and we're like, yeah, that's it. So like, I mean, this just, I know it's very graphic, and this shows you like, what's happened in the last, 20 years at most, but really, I would say actually just the last 10 to 5 years, the level of cameras and what they can capture has increased so tremendously that images like this now exist. All I did was remove one of the boxers. But this is like footage coming from YouTube, and again, just thinking about, just the difference between what I could get off of a VHS tape in the late 90s and what's available for free through YouTube now. In terms of images of the human body in the most intimate, violent situation is amazing. And it's getting more intense every year. Like when I search for images, I'm really looking for fights that happened within the last few years, because the level of slow motion, high resolution footage that has become available just in the last 5 years is, in the context of professional boxing, is insane. So in some ways I feel like these images track the evolution of the technology, and by implication, like, how the human body then inhabits that. So yeah, I'm almost at the end of what I want to show you. I started out like as a printmaker, and then learned this kind of like very specific animation process, rotoscoping. But the longer I've been doing it, I just, become more and more fascinated with the full scope of what's increasingly available in terms of filmmaking in general, and what the implications are for like our way of walking through the world with cameras, and like, having relationships with cameras. And so one thing I discovered just like a couple of years ago is this thing like Foley sound. Like every movie is made first as a moving image with like, all the footage shot and then cut together, and then after that's done, then a soundtrack is created. And the soundtrack, it entails like a lot of people doing meticulous work where every single little sound is constructed. Rarely ever, outside of like Dogma, that movement in the 90s, where it was all natural sound, all natural light. Like the more typical thing is that the soundtrack that you hear as being kind of just like the sound of what's happening in the film, like that is meticulously constructed. So I did this project to kind of explore that, specifically with these two senior Foley artists in Thailand. And so basically I asked them to make a soundtrack for the Pacquiao-Mayweather fight, and everything in it except the audience. And then they allowed me to bring cameras in to watch them as they work. So you'll see them working on this at some point.
Yeah.
สุดยอดอ่ะ สรุปเป็นลมยังไงนะ เบียร์ก็อย่ามัวแต่ก้มหน้าก้มตาอาบนะ
ทำไมอ่ะ
โชคดูมากล้มตึ้ง
ตรงที่มันโหมเข้ามาตรงนี้นั่นแหละ
นะต้องหนักนิดเนาะ
ปึกครับผม
ต้องมาเต็มตัวเลยอ่ะ
ครับผม
Like the Foley artists typically
Okay.
work for about a minute in real time, and then they stop,
ครับ
and then the editor in the control room kind of syncs the sounds to the image, and they discuss whether the sound's good enough. That's what they're doing here.
Chật.
โหวิ่งจ็อกกิ้งเลย
โอ้โหวิ่งชิบหาย
ครับ
I hesitate to show it in this form because really the way it should be seen is on two very large screens, and so you physically like stand between the screens, and the sound moves from the left side to the right side as the action changes, and there's like on one screen you're seeing the fight with the kind of the invented soundtrack. On the other side you're seeing the studio where the soundtrack is being made, and you're kind of going in and out of like two different, of real time and edit time. And in the installation, the sound jumps from left to right whenever you move from real time into edit time, and then edit time back into real time. And it's a perceivable difference. So, I mean, all I can say is that in some ways, like, I'm aware now because of responses that I've received that this could be read as kind of like, almost like, you know, taking the fun out of the fight, or like a critique of the artificiality of like this intense violence that we experience. If that's what people see, then, you know, maybe that I can't protest that. But my intention was actually almost more like to get inside the head of these Foley artists who you know, like 8 hours a day do this thing where they break down reality into these minute sound bites and then reproduce them. It's like in some ways I would argue like that we are doing that on a daily basis without always realizing it. Anyway, I'd like to just show you one more.
ได้ละ
โอเค
อันนี้
เดี๋ยวลองดูอินไซด์ช็อตนะครับ
ครับ
นั่นแหละได้เลยครับ
ย่ำอยู่กับที่ใช่ไหม
ฝั่งโน้นนะ
เดี๋ยวเขาดูนิดมันอยู่กับที่
นะ
ผมย่ำเลยนะตรงนี้นะ
จำตั้งแต่ออฟสกรีนตรงนี้ไปเลยครับ
yes
โอเคครับ
yes
หัวหายมีกระโดดนิดนึงฮะ
ไม่เริ่มไม่ทัน
ได้นะครับตอนนี้
ครับ
ดูจังหวะนะฮะ
อ่ะ
ปึ๊กปึ๊ก
อ่า
ปึ๊กปึ๊กปึ๊กแค่นี้ครับ
อ่า
โอเคแป๊บนึงฮะ
นึก
เข้ากระโดดนิดนึงนะครับ
จ้า
เอาเลยนะครับ
เอามา
เดี๋ยวเราปล่อยยาวสักนิดนึงนะครับผม
จ้า
โอเคครับ
ไป
โอเคแป๊บนะฮะ
ไออันนั้นไม่ก็ดี ขาด
อันนั้นเลยครับ
คัด
ขอ
ตรงนี้ใหม่
ขอตรงพอมันต่อยอย่างเงี้ยครับ ปึ๊บ
ปึ๊บ
ฟืบเท้าเนี่ยฮะสีออกมาหน่อยฮะ
โอเค ไม่มีสีใช่ไหม สีทำได้
The significance of this taking place in Thailand is that, like the whole Hong Kong
Okay, back.
Chinese
อ๋อ สีเดียวอ่ะ
film industry does the majority of its production work in Vietnam and Thailand, where it's less expensive. So this is like one of the biggest film production post houses in Southeast Asia. This is something that preceded the last thing you saw. Is a sound project, and the idea behind the sound project was to recreate the soundtrack from the 1966 World Cup, which was like, I think, almost like a religious text for English people, because it's the only time that the English won, and they invented the game. So this was a commission for an art project in London, and I just wanted to show it to you because I like the visual of what this turned out to be as a sound project, and just the simple point. I mean, you're seeing this is the way it was displayed in the Hamburger Bahnhof, the National Museum in Berlin, and the wall is lined with speakers, and you're in this big white room, and you're hearing this intense sound of a crowd. And the way it was produced was it was created using like a hired crowd of 1,000 men, non-actors, in the Philippines, in a movie theater. And what we did in the movie theater was like analyzed and then performed, almost like a game, all of the chants and songs and even the national anthem of the English team, and then the same thing, the chants and the songs of the German fans who were in Wembley Stadium. 1966 Cup was England versus Germany. So a lot of undertones having to do with the Second World War. And a lot of religious songs sung. I mean, just like a very rich kind of layered text, all rendered with this like Filipino accent, which was not immediately perceptible, I think, because in some ways like a crowd just sounds like a crowd, especially if they're singing like British football anthems. But then this wall which had a little video on it. If you went behind the wall, you would discover a 2-channel video showing you the game on one side from 1966, and then scenes of the crowd in the movie theater, in this IMAX movie theater in Manila. At which point, then when you went back in, then you would hear the Filipino accent. The little screen itself just showed like one player stumbling around the field. It's been shown in a number of places, and in every case it's like this, like it's just a big empty room with the sound of the crowd in it. It would be super dissatisfying to like bake 17 channels of sound down into like one, so I'm not going to play the sound. So instead I'm going to show you this other project, which was done around the same time in a way. For the Sydney Biennial, I collaborated with this design firm in Sydney to take the Sydney Olympic Stadium, 100,000 seat stadium, and expand it into a 1 million seat stadium. And then we then took the plans, the drawings for this 1 million seat stadium back to Manila again, and hired basically like a town of primarily women, like craftspeople, to like build this model in sections, and then shipped it back to Sydney and assembled it. So there's our model of a 1 million seat stadium with every seat articulated. It was shown once in Sydney and then put in storage for like 10 years, and just last year was reinstalled in Brazil at this amazing place called Inhotim in like Belo Horizonte. It's like a museum built in like in an arboretum, like a nature park. I don't know how to describe it, but if you ever have a chance to go there, it's amazing. And it's really like, it's an explication of like Tropicalia, the British modernist, like kind of radical art movement from the 70s, a kind of a response to like the oppressive government at the time. Anyway, it's like a really interesting episode in like global modernism, the Tropicalia movement in Brazil. Okay, and then the last thing I was going to show you, since I started out with Justin Bieber, I'm going to end with it. I just kind of got obsessed with him for a period because I really found him to be the Matrix. Like, I can't even begin to get into it, but one thing is that, he's in some ways like the first YouTube discovered like pop star. He was discovered when he was like 7 or 8 on YouTube, where his mom and he would like post videos of him. And so like he really, even though he's obviously grown up now, he starts out as the child. And the Beliebers were originally like all children, right? They were like all children, like his age. So in some ways, like part of what makes him a matrix is this combination of seeming contradictions, that he's a child and represents innocence, but he's like a global pop star. And so he's like a king. He's like the global pop king who is also a child. So it's like innocence and extreme power in one image. That's just one level of the matrix. That is Justin Bieber to me. Another one is, white kid, like really inhabiting the traditions of like black music and produced by Usher and black Hollywood producers, very intentionally, like, you know, shaping a certain kind of like voice and aesthetic, which you know, undeniably comes, I mean, is, you know, is borrowing so much from traditions of black music. And so, like a related project that I've been working on is this thing called, it is a project called Incarnator. And it's an exploration of the centuries-old tradition of religious image making in the Philippines. You know, it comes with the Spanish. The Spanish were sort of colonial controllers of the Philippines for like 500 years, starting from the 1500s. And so there's like an extremely intense tradition of like a Catholic, like laced with animism, and you know, all of the Spanish traditions through Mexico were imported into the Philippines around the making of images in wood. And the last stage of creating an icon, say of like the Virgin Mary or the crucifixion, is the step where the wood is painted to appear like flesh. And the artist who does that is called the encarnador, the person who like incarnates or like creates flesh. And so I went to literally the top saint maker, like santo maker in the Philippines, this guy named Willie Layog, and asked him to make an image of Justin Bieber. And so, you know, this guy, like, he's certified from Rome. Like, he's the guy that people go to if, like, any of the old saints need a paint job in any of the big famous churches. So, like, extremely skilled. He actually studied in Spain. And somehow, like, you know, I specifically wanted him to do, like, a statue of Justin Bieber as a child, because in the Philippines, the most famous, the most venerated icon of all is called the Santo Niño, the child Jesus. And the myth, or like the legend, is that Magellan, when he was going around, he brought this image of the Santo Niño with him, and he traded it with a guy named Lapu-Lapu for whatever, and shortly after that actually died, like got killed by the villagers in this island in the Philippines, Cebu. But meanwhile, this really strange statue of the child Jesus dressed as a king, but with the proportions really strange, like almost like a dwarf or something, exists to this day in the Basilica de Santo Niño de Cebu in the Philippines. And right about now, there's a thing happening there called Sinulog. It happens every January, where like millions of people come to venerate this like statue that's about this high. Like to me, really, it crystallized these like rambling thoughts I was having about Justin Bieber. You know, because he was coming to do a concert in the Philippines, and then suddenly I realized, oh, he's the Santo Niño of the 21st century, you know, and like children all around the world see him as like an emblem of their desires to be, you know, agents in the 21st century, you know, like that's his power, is like, he represents the possibility of like becoming like a global player in a way and speaking the global language. So it's no coincidence that he's become an evangelist, you know, like yeah. So the one kind of thing I decided was that well, the way the saints are made, they usually have like joints, and then the arms go on and so forth. And this was supposed to be a crucifix. But I found it more interesting to keep it dismembered. That's Willie Layog's signature on the right, at the bottom. And I mean, he didn't get all the tattoos, but all the tattoos that he put on are from Justin Bieber's body. And then we made a few more things. This was like a kid that we scanned while he was sitting on a tree branch. Just his leg, though. So that's it. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to stop by playing this video, Morning After the Deluge. It's kind of long, so I'm just going to let it play in the background.
I was wondering, I'm not very up to date on like laws and legal issues and things, and I was wondering, when you grab from what I assume from what I just heard, there are images and footage that you grab from YouTube and things on the internet. Is the sheer fact that you're just manipulating them make them your property then, or how does that work as far as what you're able to do, or it's just out there and it's?
I think it's all about like how unevenly the law is applied. Basically, where there's money to be made, that's where it's applied. Yeah.
So
and what's interesting to me now is that, you know, like, in some ways, like big brand artists, like say Jay-Z and Beyonce, like obviously, like, you know, sample as much as anybody else. In fact, I would argue that, you know, this communication strategy that I'm associating with mass religion, I would say that's just like one facet of a bigger phenomenon that I think of as like remix culture, sampling. To me, sampling is the language that we have now, and we do it all the time. Like we do it with our own images. We like, you know, absorb and spit back out other images. Like we put ourselves together from like, you know, fragments of images. Just think about like sportswear. So yeah, like all I know is, like just last month, I was in negotiations with an ad agency in London who wanted to do an ad campaign with this like super high profile British boxer. I'm so sorry, I'm like forgetting his name right now. But like a mental health campaign, and they were, you know, asking for my permission to basically use, you know, like the removed boxer. They wanted to show this, they wanted to make an ad featuring like a boxer that was being like hit by an invisible opponent, to somehow illustrate some ideas around mental health. And, you know, like they, so, you know, I said, you know, if you can give me access to the same footage you're using, in return, I will certainly give permission. And at the end of the day, like, you know, they talked, and but they could not give me permission, or they could not get permission from BT or whatever sports broadcaster owns the footage. And it's just like one example of that kind of thing. So I'm not worried about it. Yeah, I don't think there's enough money in my vicinity to like merit, you know, people sending lawyers against me. And I just feel like literally all of you are doing it. Like, I am so not alone in doing it. We all do it. And it's wonderful, I think.
Any other questions out there? I saw you looking.
I
at
mean,
me
sorry,
like-
just one last thing. Of course, in the news now is the fact that, what do you call that? Like high school, college level athletes are, for the first time in history, being allowed to actually make money on their own images, something that was forbidden up until now. Like what the implications are of like self-exploitation and what that will open up for both good and bad, to me is like a matter of intensity, of increasing intensity. But like ultimately, I kind of feel like implicated in this process is not just images, but like people ourselves. Like that's what's trippy to me is, you know, we're living with the cameras and it's, you know, we see those cases of like young people who just like didn't think before they posted and then their lives are ruined. Or, you know, people who get canceled because they were just careless. I don't know, like something about the dissolution of, you know, line between private identity and like corporate consumer own, you know, kind of culture has been super crossed.
So I'm curious if you can expand upon this sort of idea in the stadium, because to me it seems like there's this very gendered labor in having all of these women build this sort of traditionally male space of a stadium that's like super interesting to me, and I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
I made a point to say it.
No,
It was obviously like in the pictures you can see it. I just found it fascinating. I mean, actually, what it was is that I wanted to produce the piece digitally in China, but there wasn't enough time, and I didn't have enough money, and so the alternative was to do it manually. And a fabricator in the Philippines told me about this town of skilled craftspeople, predominantly women, and it so happened that their entire industry had just moved to China, and so they were jobless. And I was like, bingo, like let's hire the town to make this. So I thought of it as like a civic project, and yes, like, you know, the fact that it was like an army of women led by, you know, industrial engineers who were also women, it made me think of like a beehive. And to me, a stadium is like a beehive. But then the other part of your question is, to me, like, you know, the presence of like gender in this work in some ways like super amplified way is like the presence of race in this work. And it's not accidental. I mean, all I really want to say about it is like, you know, that I'm very interested in the role of race and the role of gender in the image-making traditions of the US. And to me, that's like super deep. And in some ways, I feel like, particularly now, there's a way in which to talk about such things inevitably, like, often gets stuck on a certain level for whatever reason. So the idea of like infiltrating the matrix with like racialized and gendered messages as a kind of exploration of like things that we know are going on and aren't spoken is interesting, because it sort of has the potential, in my mind, this is at least my intention around it, is that it like circumvents or even, you know, like short circuits a certain kind of like default conversation about such things, and then opens up into like a territory that's less familiar.
To me, it sort of like felt like almost like medieval, like the sort of medieval tapestries that were made or that, this almost Colosseum-like space where it's like you can imagine a battle of some sort taking place and sort of the invisible labor behind that. So it's very interesting to me that you expanded it out to this enormous space of onlookers and the space being completely empty of those onlookers. You know, and then the fact that you show the slide with the women, I just find it kind of interesting. It was like a strange kind of juxtaposition.
I mean, I really, like, at the end of that project, I kind of was kicking myself because I realized at the end that like, in some ways, I was less interested in the sculpture than in the process, and I should have made a film. Like, and I'm kind of actually except I don't know how to make a film. So I'm like learning how to make film because I'm going to make that film.
Yeah.
They did it in 3 months, from start to finish, including like trial and error to figure out what kind of materials they would use. Like, it was so quick. Yeah, and in a way it was interesting to me because we were using wood crafts people, metal crafts people, like basically craft traditions in Manila that are like disappearing. So in some ways, like, the whole process was a study in almost like 20th century craft traditions in the Philippines.
Just so you know, that averages out to 11,111 chairs per day.
Wow. That's cool. I mean, it's, the editing process is the same. There's like an extreme amount of labor involved in the editing processes.
Your work, it feels like very interesting the way that you are sort of poking holes in matrices. And I want to know more about what it's like to like further poke holes in that matrix by being here and speaking about your work that's supposed to not really be seen in this context, and what that's like for you as an artist and cutting that layer another layer deeper.
Well, I mean, actually, it's a positive thing for me because I'm showing work which is like, there was some recent work, but also work that's years old. And, to me, the world is changing so fast. And it's throwing me off. Or, like, in a way, like, I mean, I do think we're really processing how to be an artist, or like how to be a designer, how to be a communicator, given the way that the world is changing, as fast as it's changing. So I was thinking about it while I was putting it together. I mean, I really procrastinated, almost like I couldn't handle to like revisit this stuff. But then finally doing it, it's really like an amazing opportunity. So thank you for letting me do it, because it just reminds me of what I was after. And I don't know, it just gives me a little extra energy about like stuff I'm trying to do now. And mostly what I'm trying to do now is trying to figure out, like, I knew how to say a certain thing at a certain time, and now like the world has totally changed, and it's not like things have gotten better or worse or something like that. It's just the nature, in a way, like of the way we communicate has changed, and I'm truly, like I feel like a student trying to figure out what that is, and to me, like, filmmaking has a lot to do with it, sound has a lot to do with it, just how like and hypnosis has a lot to do with it. I'm glad Gretchen said that, because to me, like, we've clearly moved past a kind of like a verbal, like a primarily verbal mode, and we're now playing with how to like shape like thoughts that we're almost like not even aware of, through like uses of sound. I think it's like so exciting and also scary, but mostly exciting.
How do you maintain, like, it feels like the work that you're doing, even though it is looking at sometimes very intense topics, this playfulness in the face of it?
I mean, yeah, like, in some ways, I do think that there's just there's a certain aspect of image making which has to do with violence. Like violence on people in the process of like turning them into images. And that's so clear. And I mean, all I can say is like, I'm really interested in artists and filmmakers who are like really experimenting with documentary form and like trying to make images in situations that are like where the line between art and life is super thin. People like in photography, like, I don't know, like Latoya Ruby Frazier, and many others, or like in filmmaking, people like, I mean, there's just so many, it's so rich. But I think of like, there's a Thai filmmaker, Apichat Pongweerasetakul, and I sat in on a master class that he gave at Columbia University, and he said that, he always works with the same actors, and he said, I'm gonna keep working with them until we're all old. So by the end of this, like, I'm basically I'm documenting their lives. And the way I'm documenting it is that, when it's time to make a movie, like I figure out some simple rules, and they agree to play the game with me, and then we play the game. And to me, this describes like, a playfulness about some stuff that's actually like really deep and kind of dark, about how we live with cameras and the extreme accessibility of one to another to like do what you will. Like, I think it's so easy to like get into somebody's life and just like tell a story with it. And in some ways, it's not interesting to me to like disavow that or like pull back from it. The question is really like how to like, I don't know, how to make that dynamic as playful and as exciting as possible and real and like engage people. Like this thing with the Georgia Redcoat Band, like having them play what they play in a football game in the Apollo Theater in New York. Like, I don't think any of us was ready for that. Because, like, that's just not something that usually happens. And, the University of Georgia Band is this is a historically white school. So it's not like, you could lean back on some notion of the band representing some aspect of like black music tradition in the house of, in the temple of like black music. It was much more jarring than that. Like it was really like, spaces possessing each other in a way where, like when they sang the national anthem, like art world people like got up and like they didn't know what to do. Like, they'd never been put on the spot about like how they would respond to a prompt to express patriotism. And like you saw people like put their hand over their chest and like, it was super uncomfortable. But then, I don't know, like, the fact that this very unlikely group of people got together to do this, and then what they're walking away with from it, I think is really cool.
How do you approach commissioning work from places like the Philippines and Thailand that are outsourced for their cheap labor market? How do you financially approach that?
I mean, the people I work with are pretty smart because, yeah, like the Philippines is a huge part of the national economy has to do with outsourcing. And so in some ways, to me, like the Philippines is interesting, both because, it's very specific in its relationship to the United States. United States was a commonwealth for like 50 years. And culturally speaking, longer, like really the whole 20th century, the Philippines was under extreme influence of the US. So, I mean, in some ways, the Philippines is just like another filter to look at American culture. And then, you know, people there they've done the math and they know what to charge. And, you know, because there's a lot of businesses that have to do with outsourcing labor. In fact, you know, there's like Facebook. I think there's like a Dutch filmmaker that just came out with a film last year or last couple of years called The Cleaners. There's like click farms in the Philippines that do all the censoring. And like that's the real face of labor in the Philippines. Like apparently the workforce in that industry, there's like a high rate of suicide. Like basically, you know, they're the ones who look at the beheadings and the child pornography so that we don't have to. That's what the cleaners are. So like, you know, the relationships are so like intensely intimate in a super unexpected way. And in some ways, I feel like, you know, to make work there is to imbue the work with that texture of that relationship. In some ways, I don't want to say this like lightly, but, you know, in some ways I feel like it's a way of like bearing witness to that kind of complexity. Sorry, was that too dark?
Clearly, we could talk all night, Paul, but we'll have to wrap it up tonight. Can we give him a round of applause and all of you? Amazing. Thank you.